China's getting real nervous about the current state of relationship between Vietnam and the United States, and it's pretty complicated to say the very least. To be honest, it's been one of the most complicated East and West relationships for a very long time. The Vietnam War is forever remembered as a time of tragic political blunders that set two nations against each other. America and Vietnam, specifically North Vietnam, became bitter enemies. Caught up within the deep ideological fault lines of the Cold War, the American involvement in supporting the non-communist South Vietnam dragged on, whose effects still remain visible today. This is something that you'd think would make China and Vietnam natural allies. Indeed, China did support Vietnam throughout the war, but it didn't take long afterwards for a bitter enmity to develop. It continues to this day, made only worse by the fact that Vietnam and the United States are achieving an unprecedented level of cooperation and goodwill. Sounds kind of like an old-fashioned game of love triangle. Pretty damn complicated, but how exactly did we get here? And yeah, where exactly are we headed? Chapter 1. A Socialist Non-Brotherhood. It may be surprising to some of you that China and Vietnam only had normalized relations since 1991. Yeah, both countries clashed constantly over national interests since the end of the Vietnam War, which saw the socialist North Vietnamese government led by Le Duan annex South Vietnam in 1975. Not only was China agitated at the fact that Vietnam leaned towards the Soviet Union for support, Vietnam had also invaded Cambodia in December 1978 to overthrow the China-aligned Khmer Rouge regime. These were just some of the issues, along with the dispute regarding their 806-mile-long border that caused China to invade Vietnam, kicking off the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979. Vietnam arguably won that one, as China was unable to keep the Khmer Rouge in power under pressure from the Soviet Union. The series of events that was just described may seem strange considering both countries shared the common experience of being victimized by foreign imperialism. But the rivalry between the two countries stretches back nearly 2,000 years. Vietnam had previously been a long-time victim of Chinese imperialism. The history of the Vietnamese nation can be traced back to a kingdom referred to as the Nan Yu in Chinese. This stretched across much of what is today southern China up to central Vietnam. It didn't take long for this kingdom to be threatened by China under the rule of the Han Dynasty, who eventually conquered it after a series of wars. Vietnamese historians trace this as the beginning of Chinese domination of Vietnam that continued intermittently from 111 BCE to 939 CE, and another brief period of domination in the 15th century by the Ming Dynasty. Indeed, Chinese culture and customs do still influence the Vietnamese today. And yeah, today, the conflict primarily manifests in the form of the China-Vietnam maritime border. Tensions have been particularly high regarding a set of crucial islands that threatened war between the two yet again in the 21st century. Chapter 2. Spratly and Paracel Conflict. While the two countries settled their disputes regarding their 806-mile land border, a burning issue remains, one that seriously tested the patience of both sides. China envisions its sea territories looking something like this. This is colloquially known as the 9-dash line, referring to the sea border demarcation lines that are used to capture its dimensions. Spanning 1.35 million square miles of sea area, it covers 90% of the surface area of the South China Sea. Within this claim are the Paracel and Spratly archipelagos. Both sets of small islands are uninhabited, but being able to militarize them offers significant strategic advantages to project military might. China has real control of the Paracels, administering a civilian population of 1,400 as of 2014. The islands are divided into the Northern Amphitrite Group and the Southern Crescent Group, with a distance of about 50 miles between them. Vietnam disputes their control on the basis of control of the islands by the previous French colonial administration in 1932. During the Vietnam War, China evoked its own claim handed over to them from the surrendering Japanese who had occupied the islands during World War II. It must be noted that this claim went to the Republic of China government, which now only controls Taiwan. The People's Republic of China government that controls China now takes ownership of the claim on the basis of the One China policy, which denies the legitimacy of the government in Taiwan and takes over all of its issues within the international community. Indeed, the Beijing government had started to exert control over the Northern Islands in 1949, while Vietnam fought for its independence from France and continued to fight its North-South Civil War. The Southern Crescent Group Islands were controlled by the South Vietnamese government during the war, and their control was slowly chipped away by China to control the Amphitrite Group completely. In 1974, China launched the Battle of the Paracel Islands, a large naval battle involving battleships and marine infantry to take over the Crescent Group from the South Vietnamese defending forces. Aware of what the future would be, the North Vietnamese refused to congratulate the Chinese against an anti-socialist power, and instead praised the South Vietnamese troops that tried their best to defend the islands. Since then, Vietnam has continued to raise the issue over rightful control of the Paracel Islands. Tensions simmered in 2014 as the Chinese began an oil drilling project close to territories that Vietnam claimed as part of its own exclusive economic zone. And if you're thinking what we think you're thinking, you'd be right. The Paracel Islands hold significant hydrocarbon resources, making its control a critical issue for a Vietnamese economy dwarfed by the Chinese one at 18 trillion US dollars. These natural resources could hold the key to supercharging the Vietnamese economy to go along with its already impressive growth rate. Proper industrialization and digitalization are likely seen as cornerstones for Vietnam's survival against outside forces in the 21st century. This made it a critical issue for the Permanent Court of Arbitration when Vietnam took its case following the oil drilling standoff. Based on the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, the court ruled against the Chinese 9-dash line entirely in terms of economic exclusivity, meaning they could not build oil rigs in the Paracels without Vietnam's consent. However, the Chinese response to the ruling was dismissive, and they had the backing of Russia, Pakistan, Sudan, and a few others, while Vietnam's neighbors remained neutral. But why did they remain neutral? Well, it's because the ruling also affected bilateral relations between themselves and economic exclusion guarantees regarding the other set of islands, the Spratly Islands. Located a further 472 miles southeast of the Paracel Islands, the Spratlys are a larger collection of more than 100 islands, reefs, and atolls. China claims the entirety of it within the 9-dash line and has taken control of some of it. Of course, Vietnam also claims all of them and has taken control over some of the reefs and islands. But this is a powder keg of a situation in which the Philippines, Brunei, and Malaysia also claim portions. Each claimant maintains a degree of military presence in these islands, making it another point of tension. Then again, Vietnam, being part of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations with these countries, has seen a tendency of cooperation between them against China as time passed. But this is not NATO. China's first major conflict with Vietnam over the Spratlys took place in 1988, when a skirmish between Chinese and Vietnamese naval units resulted in China taking control of the Johnson Reef in the southern Spratlys. Since then, the only major development in Vietnam's favor has been the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling, which China has simply ignored without anyone to enforce it. Thus, the status of the islands remains in limbo, as each country involved has simply cut out pieces. It has also been an avenue for Vietnam to cooperate with the Philippines as China encroaches on Philippine territory in the Mischief Reef, located on the northeastern side of the Spratlys. For Vietnam, China looms as an overbearing threat that is chipping away at its territories and keeps it locked down. The echoes of Chinese domination in the ancient past are visible. Naturally, this forces Vietnam to seek powerful allies apart from the Philippines. Chapter 3. The American Counterweight. This has been a dispute ripe for geopolitical gains, specifically for anyone able to position themselves on either side. These gains were exploited by the Soviet Union before 1991 to the best of their abilities to try to understand Chinese ambitions. Soviet actions were driven also by a desire to check the United States by proxy, as China under Deng Xiaoping was slowly getting closer to the United States. It all worked out since the hatred against the USA was still fresh among the Vietnamese due to the war. But now, the USA would be the one to exploit it to get closer to Vietnam. And just like that, the tables started to turn in the 1990s and 2000s as Vietnam and the United States decided to normalize relations coinciding with free market reforms in Vietnam. In 2013, both countries signed a comprehensive partnership agreement on civilian fields. This became the backbone from which relations could be taken further. Relations improved, especially after 2014, as China and the United States positioned each other as sworn rivals. It coincided with anti-China protests in Vietnam and the military standoff in the Paracels, with the United States voicing verbal support for Vietnam. 2 years later, in 2016, the United States would back Vietnam's claims in the Permanent Court of Arbitration. It had the effect of rallying quite a few NATO bloc countries onto Vietnam's side when they otherwise probably would have been ambivalent. 2016 was also the year when President Barack Obama signed the lifting of the arms embargo on Vietnam that it had previously placed. The next chapter came with Vietnam agreeing to host President Donald Trump's talks with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in Hanoi. Both presidents have done much to keep the momentum of improved relations going. What followed made China nervous quite a lot, as the two countries were now cooperating in defense and military affairs. This included training programs and military exercises. Here, there has been another player that we briefly mentioned in this video, but otherwise have been keeping quiet about. Indeed, Taiwan, or the ambitious Republic of China, has been a key factor in the Vietnam-United States relationship. This is even though Taiwan also claims the 9-dash line, including the small Bailongwei Island along with the Dongsha and Zhongsha Islands. As far as it concerns Vietnam, it's the Bailongwei Island that is at the center of the dispute. Due to Taiwan's harsh anti-socialist bend, relations have historically been poor, but modifications to Taiwan's foreign policy since then have made unofficial cooperation between Vietnam and Taiwan more of a reality. This is particularly visible in the number of Taiwanese electronics companies building factories in Vietnam in order to join the trend, the southward shift of manufacturing investments away from China. Foxconn, Compal, Pegatron, Wistron, and Chista are just some examples. 40% of Taiwan's foreign investments are in the Southeast Asia region, with Vietnam coming in second place within that. The United States seeks to form a sort of containment field around China in the South China Sea. Its nominal ally, India, also plays a major role in this, contributing to it with its own necklace theory. More on the necklace theory later, though. We'll have a video dropping soon all about it. So if you haven't done so already, please smash that like button. Also be sure to subscribe and tap that bell icon so you don't miss it. Thanks, you're officially part of the Republic now. Given Vietnam's socialist government and its proximity to China, the country has become a top priority for U.S. policymakers, hopeful for a strong alliance in the future. It lines up Taiwan's status as a major U.S. military ally in the South China Sea, with the U.S. only paying lip service to the One China policy. That's why, for the time being, Vietnam and Taiwan unofficially cooperate on matters relating to territorial disputes in the South China Sea between themselves and common conflicts with China. Without Taiwan being able to exert overbearing influence and power at the expense of China, the disputes specifically relating to Taiwan and Vietnam are to lie dormant. Coming back to the U.S. Vietnam relationship, it has now blossomed into discussions for Vietnam to purchase heavy equipment, such as the advanced variants of the American F-16 fighter aircraft as of 2023. And guess what? 2023 was also the year in which President Joe Biden and President Vo Van Thuong upgraded diplomatic relations to the highest level short of a bilateral military alliance. China had already been ramping up militarization of the islands and had drawn up a harsher imposition of the One China policy for its allies and neighbors, including, of course, Vietnam. It should be noted that China explicitly warned the Philippines to not, quote, play with fire after President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. congratulated the election victory of President Lai Ching-te. President Lai is the chairman of the anti-Beijing Democratic Progressive Party, which categorically rejects the One China policy. In response to the strengthening of relations, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning has stated that a Cold War mentality was at play, accusing the United States of using the agreement as a chess move to counter China. Concerningly, Mao Ning also reminded Vietnam of its own agreements and cooperation with China. This is where the complications lie. Chapter 4. Tempered Expectations. All of this spells good days ahead for Vietnam and the United States to grow ever closer to each other. But it's important to keep in mind that the relationship hasn't been upgraded to the status of a full military alliance yet. That's because Vietnam has to contend with the simple, cruel geographical realities of being China's neighbor. In the globalized world, the Vietnamese economy relies on trade with China. So here it is. China is Vietnam's largest trading partner, with a trade turnover of $172 billion in 2023. Conversely, Vietnam has been China's largest trading partner within the Southeast Asia region. It's not a simple nor an easy thing for a Vietnamese leader to declare a complete enmity against China. Doing so would threaten the lives of many Vietnamese who depend on trade with China and would also bring a noticeable negative impact on general prosperity, food shortages, and whatnot. This would also be disadvantageous to any Vietnamese head of government who doesn't lead with an iron fist, unlike Xi Jinping. But to be honest, even for President Xi, openly and permanently hostile relations with Vietnam would undermine his efforts to capture influence. This is a serious problem if China is ever going to pull Southeast Asia firmly within its orbit. But with the calendar turning to 2024, it appears that in the short run, things may just turn out well for China. Again, the close geographical proximity and the deep economic reliance that Vietnam has on China makes it easier for the latter to take action to influence the pistons of power in the country. Since leadership in Vietnam is taken collectively, opportunities exist to help friendly candidates wield power. This is seemingly what happened after President Vo Van Thuong suddenly announced his resignation as the General Secretary of the Vietnamese Communist Party, Nguyen Phu Trong, took over more responsibilities. Internal elections gave way for former Police General Tu Lam to be the new president. It's important to note that Vo Van Thuong was implicated in an anti-corruption campaign led by these two men, with Tu Lam having had a career as a top general in the Vietnamese National Police. He is generally understood to be a more authoritarian and pro-China candidate. These two are proponents of the bamboo diplomacy theory, which puts a greater emphasis on flexibility and careful maintenance of relations between all powers, especially to help China breathe easy. The much-hyped F-16 Block 70 deal between the U.S. and Vietnam from last year also appears to have died on the vine. Vietnam getting a hold of American heavy weaponry would make it rather easy for the country's armed forces to supply themselves with American aid. In the context of the rest of Southeast Asia, this is especially concerning for China, and the armed forces of the Philippines and Taiwan almost exclusively used American-made equipment or indigenous weapons derived from American technology. No doubt, China would want to eliminate the mere idea of that becoming a possibility in the far future. Hoang Viet, an expert on South China Sea affairs, remarked that Vietnam was most afraid of adverse reactions from China when it comes to upgrading relations with the U.S. and Japan. The U.S. had pushed Vietnam for the relationship elevation for a long time, and Vietnam had to choose a right time for it. Otherwise, it will face anger from China. Looking back at spokesperson Nao Ming's words, you may be starting to think that she had specifically chosen her words a year ago when President Vo signed the high-level agreement with President Biden. Maybe this was exactly what she foreshadowed. On that note, Dr. Bill Hayton, writing for Chatham House, notes in broad strokes that powers opposed to China should temper their expectations now, even if Vietnam may not want to downgrade relations. He notes that popular opinion in Vietnam is against China. Data from Statista goes as far as proving that the Vietnamese would prefer allying with the United States if forced to. This is also backed up by data from the Pew Research Center, which shows that the Vietnamese public perception of China tends to be negative. But the appointment of police candidate Tu Lam to power may just be to manage that by force. Despite being billed as pro-China candidates by outside sources, a combination of public pressure and self-interest means that bamboo diplomacy will probably continue to be as balanced as possible. This is not completely ideal for China either. But then again, keep in mind that bamboo diplomacy is likely to be tested to its breaking point regarding Vietnamese relations with Taiwan. That has to be the red line for Vietnam that China is unwilling to let go of, especially with President Lai Ching-te in power in Taiwan. While the story of bitter enemies becoming steadfast allies is very much a positive and inspirational story, it's important to remember that friends are never permanent when it comes to geopolitics. There are only permanent interests, and even these interests can vary depending on who is in power and from election to election. Upgrading the U.S. Vietnam relationship to a full military alliance would certainly set off alarm bells in Beijing. They cannot let this happen under any circumstances. Nevertheless, the progress that has been made so far keeps them permanently in deep anxiety. Enjoyed the video? Make sure you show some love by tapping that subscribe button. You're officially part of the Republic now. Also, be sure to click a thumbnail to dive right back into more amazing content from our channel.